Well, to everyone who just joined us, hi, and thank you for joining us this evening to launch this extremely timely and important title, Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine by Geoff Manaugh and Nicola Twilley, as part of our summer public program. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Manaugh and I run the public program here at the AA. And this conversation tonight is part of a project that commenced long before COVID-19 triggered a global pandemic. And instead, it charts the rich history around stories of emergency isolation in different locations around the world. And it really situates our current moment as part of a longer trajectory with speculations and simulations of future quarantines on the horizon. So to launch this book virtually at the AA Bookshop tonight, Geoff is author of Building Blog and A Burglar's Guide to the City, and Nicola, journalist and co-host of the Gastropod, are joined by senior curator of exhibitions at the B&A, Brendan Cormier, who also leads their Pandemic Objects project to discuss quarantine in its many forms and guises. The book will be available for a special launch price of £20 throughout the month of July from the AA Bookshop, and Andrew from the bookshop is posting links in the chat of how you can get that. But I guess before I pass on to Brendan to start tonight's conversation, I just wanted to say, in terms of logistics, if you have any questions, please post these in the chat. Or if you'd like to ask the question yourself, you can also raise your hand at any point throughout the conversation and we can unmute you to ask your question. But yeah, I guess with that, please join me in welcoming Brendan, Geoff, and Nicola to the AA for this virtual book launch.
Great, thanks for having us. Thanks for organizing this and being this a kind host for this event, Manaugh. I'm really thrilled to be involved in this discussion today for numerous reasons. Maybe first, but not foremost, I've discovered to my shock and horror that I've been pronouncing Geoff and Nicola's names wrong for the last 10 years. So Geoff Manaugh and Nicola Twilley, welcome. I hope that's fine now. But for many years, I've been pronouncing your names wrong because for many years I've been really, really fascinated and interested in your work. I was trying to kind of pinpoint at what point that happened, and it, obviously it's way back in the golden era of the blogosphere, and with Geoff's work with Building Block and Nicola's work with Edible Geography. You have both gone on to be incredibly accomplished writers. I think you've pretty much ticked the box of every major important newspaper and magazine publication with your investigative journalism. But I think, for so much of us involved with the AA, interested in architecture, both of your work really inspires an alternative way of looking at the world, which not only expands kind of what we can do in our capacities in the world of architecture and design, but also adds an architectural lens to so many different aspects of the world that might normally not be considered architectural. So it's an incredible service you're doing, and I think you're following that with this incredible book that you've just put out, Until Proven Safe, on the history of quarantine and its role today and its future. And then, of course, maybe the third reason I'm thrilled to be hosting this is because for the last year, I've also been, really interested in pandemic-related things, running a blog called Pandemic Objects at the DNA, in which we really try to show how objects, how everyday life is mediated by objects, and how the pandemic really highlights this idea of this network of objects that take on, strange, sometimes surreal roles in our life. And I think surreal is, to a certain degree, a leitmotif that runs through your book. And we can talk about some of the more surreal aspects that crop up in it, in your research. But I wanted just to start, I think there are many people in our audience who are very much interested in the world of publishing and written projects and editorial projects. So I wanted to know, as a very basic kind of introduction, how you came upon this idea of focusing an entire book on quarantine, and then maybe how you made a roadmap to create that book, and then finally how you decided to incorporate COVID into it in the last minute.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Brendan. It's great to be doing this. Thank you so much for joining and for reading the book and being available as a as an interlocutor, and thanks to the AA.
And for the pandemic object series this past year that we've really enjoyed
really
while
That's
writing.
great.
And thanks to everybody for tuning in as well. Do you want me to jump into the question? Yeah. So I guess I'd say a couple things. I mean, there's a few questions kind of nestled in there. I'd say that I'll start actually with the last question, and we can maybe come back to it. But the funny thing was that actually when we sold the book, when we pitched it to our editors and we put it together, this was many years ago in 2016. The book was actually called The Coming Quarantine. And because our hypothesis was that we would all be quarantining more in the future, not less. And that, with epidemic diseases emerging from disrupted landscapes, with people going into rainforests and clearing them, going into caves that were previously unexplored, building huge factory farms, we're being exposed to more and more diseases that we don't have immunity to, we don't have a vaccine for, and there's no existing cure. And so the only solution would be quarantine. And so the idea was that there's this coming quarantine that we're all going to experience. And so when COVID-19 hit, at least two things happened. One was our editor was like, "Where's the effing book?" and then the other thing was we obviously had to change the title. So now it's called Until Proven Safe. The quarantine arrives.
Yeah. And I would say that, we had, in some ways it was perfectly timed because we had done so much reporting before COVID locked down the world, things that we, none of us have been able to do, travel around the Adriatic and the Mediterranean to visit the ruins of, former quarantine hospitals, lazarettos as they were called, travel to Australia, travel all around the US, visiting, the new Plum Island where high security lab for agricultural diseases, or the first federal quarantine facility to be built in more than a century, which is in the middle of the country. So it meant that we had done all the fun part. And then during lockdown, when there was nowhere to go anyway, we just stared at our screens like everyone else and didn't have to experience the usual FOMO of writers on deadline where everyone else is having fun and you're, glued to your chair. So in some ways it was great. In other ways it was really frustrating because as COVID played out, we just saw all the same mistakes happen again and again, things that we had seen in history. The demonization of Asian Americans, the way that politics interfered with what, science and public health officials were saying, the way that data and the sort of inherent uncertainty of sort of modeling and knowing where we are in a disease when the science is new and the disease transmission wasn't even understood at the start, how you communicate that around that and how that gets messed up. All of these mistakes again and again and again. People saying, well, there's no point in quarantine because it's leaky and no one's following the rules. That debate has been had for centuries. So, and in some ways, every morning was just like, we've done this before. And so it's really exciting to see our book out now so that people can maybe, and I think this speaks to what Geoff was saying. We think we're entering a new age of quarantines. I hate to be a mega downer, but this is not going to be the only pandemic of our lifetimes. And we know a lot of things we need to know to do quarantine better. So why not? Let's have a think about it and improve on it for next time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, on the one hand, I see the topic as appearing, especially perhaps when you pitched it, as seemingly niche. But obviously, because of COVID, we now all have experienced it to a certain degree. And in reading your book, what you do, I think, quite successfully is expand it to a level of understanding where you start to see notions of quarantine everywhere, which I think is part of the goal. And in that respect, I'd be curious how you set out to define what you wanted quarantine to be, because on the one hand, there is a specific definition to quarantine. On the other hand, you do break the rules slightly and you go beyond that specific definition and you go to the animal world and you go to the interplanetary world. So how did you set the boundaries for what you wanted to look at in terms of quarantine?
Sure. Well, yeah, I guess I'd say a couple things there. This kind of combines that question with the previous one, but I think that when we were first interested in the topic of quarantine, It really kind of came out of a combination of our respective interests, but also out of a particular experience when we were in Australia and we noticed a former quarantine station that had been turned into a kind of spa hotel. And I think that our initial response was simultaneously historical and architectural. Historical in the sense that quarantine felt like this obsolete thing that was leaving ruins all over the world. You know, it's you don't really see, or it seemed at the time that you don't see an active quarantine hospital. Instead, you see the ruins of one, or you see one that has been totally torn down and is only exists in history books, or you see one that's been turned into a spa hotel, or it's been turned into an art center, or some kind of art gallery or that kind of thing. And so our initial question was really, what was quarantine? But what was so interesting is that, as you just mentioned, Brendan, you know, when you really look at it, quarantine it disappeared by becoming ubiquitous, and it's everywhere now.
One of the reasons, in fact, that Australia was such a great starting point for this book was not only that there was this quarantine station that we then actually ended up staying at for a night and sort of and you know, really getting intrigued by the idea, but you know, Geoff, bringing his architectural interest, then was sort of saying, well, this seems like a book. But to me, coming from more of a food and science background, Australia, we started, you know, you drive all over Queensland and there are signs saying, you know, banana quarantine and this, that, and the other quarantine. Australia is one of the most sort of quarantine-centric places when it comes to, you know, fruit and vegetables, agricultural products, any kind of animals. Or vegetables, bringing them in, moving them around, and that's when I realized, oh, there's something here for me too. That quarantine, as Geoff said, really is everywhere. But anyway, just to hand it back.
Yeah, you know, and then I think as far as quarantine, how we defined it and how we tracked it down. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, you know, a lot of times when we mention the book, people would instantly go to the metaphors of quarantine. So, oh, you must be writing about the Holocaust, for example, or you must be writing about you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a quarantine of Cuba, which was the term that John F. Kennedy used to describe the blockade. But we really wanted to try to be as close to medical quarantine as we could be, and also differentiate quarantine from isolation. So really briefly, another reason why quarantine seemed so good as a topic for a book or just a long investigation is that, you know, quarantine requires uncertainty. If you know that something is infected or that someone has a disease and you separate them, then they're being isolated. They're not being quarantined. So quarantine by definition means that there's something inside you or there's something inside another that has not yet emerged. And if it does, it will be a threat. And so quarantine is the time and the space you need to wait to see if that thing appears. And so instantly you can see it becomes very poetic and very exciting in terms of how you can track that across different fields and different you know, historical resonances from the Bible to human mythology to horror fiction to obviously contemporary medical practices. But so when we started looking at where quarantine pops up, you know, you're right that we do have at least one chapter that kind of breaks the rules. I would actually argue that it's the nuclear waste chapter because that is technically isolation, not quarantine.
We know it's dangerous.
Yeah, we know it's dangerous. But nevertheless, what was so interesting about that was that we wanted to look at what are the technical and cultural requirements for separating something, for isolating something, for spans of time that are much longer than human civilization, and what can that teach us about quarantine? Whereas the other ones like animal and plant quarantine and even the space quarantine, it is actually quarantine. You know, that we are actually you know, separating plants from others, like the chocolate plant, the cocoa plants outside London, so that diseases don't eradicate the world chocolate supply. And you know, and they did in fact use quarantine and they do use quarantine to help protect the earth from other off-world microbes and the other way around.
Yeah. So, and I should say that, you know, well, not only does, I mean, for example, most people, including our dearly departed former President Trump, use these terms interchangeably and sort of technically incorrectly, but even public health officials will think of them on a continuum. So there's this sort of spectrum of ways of achieving space between people, reducing encounters that could lead to transmission. You know, and to say Marty Citron, who was head of the CDC's division of quarantine, school closings are sort of on a spectrum that goes all the way to sort of extreme isolation, and goes via sort of quarantine and other, you know, lockdown, social distancing, all sorts of kind of measures that you can take just to reduce transmission are on this sort of spectrum of what they call non-pharmaceutical interventions.
I had before we get too deep into this, I had pulled out a quote that I really liked quite deep into the book. One thing that strikes me in reading the book is that actually it can almost read as a very extended design brief. And if you're ever interested in kind of pitching, maybe now is your moment to pitch a studio at the AA on this topic. Yeah. But the quote is, and forgive me because I'm naming things that the audience won't be familiar with, but you'll get the point. Places such as the WIPP, Yucca Mountain, the National Bio and Agri-Defense Facility, and even John Howard's ideal lazaretto are what results when abstract arguments over risk are given architectural form. Now that's super nice, and it feels like actually what you're trying to do in many instances is try to unpack how abstract arguments do result in that kind of form. And you do start with this kind of very curious reenactment of a travelogue from John Howard from the 18th century. First of all, kudos to you. I don't know how familiar, I've never heard of that travelogue before, but good for tracking it down. And then you meticulously go from one lazaretto to another. What were some of the key kind of findings that, other than having a really great holiday and some charming anecdotes, what do you think we can learn from looking at such old infrastructure like that?
Well, first of all, John Howard is, I was familiar with him. He has a statue in St. Paul's Cathedral, but he's best known as a prison reformer.
All right.
If anyone does know him, it's like the Howard League, which campaigns for prison reform. And there's a Canadian sort of Howard something that does the same thing. So that's what he's known for. But late in his life, he had been traveling around inspecting prison conditions in Europe, and he realized, look, there are these things called lazarettos that seem like prisons in a way. People are detained there against their will, but they're public health infrastructure. So this odd combination of sort of hospital, prison, and hotel or something. And so he was intrigued by this, decided to apply his same very, very rigorous methodology. He would always sort of show up unannounced, and even he's famous for sort of carrying his own set of scales so he could weigh the bread ration, etc. In some ways, for us, he was sort of the father of gonzo quarantine tourism. He wasn't allowed into the Marseille lazaretto because the practices of quarantine, Marseille was seen as the pinnacle of quarantine at the time, and the French were very proud of their quarantine practices and regarded them as a state secret. So they wouldn't let John Howard in, and he had to dress up as a doctor and sort of finagle his way in to get an undercover investigative report on how Marseille operated. He also deliberately put himself on a ship coming from an infected area so that he would be sent to quarantine himself in Venice and experience what others experience. So he really is like both a total one of those gonzo journalists who just, in the sort of Upton Sinclair tradition, he's like working in the factory himself. But then also for us, sort of mapped out this route that we could follow around the Adriatic and Mediterranean to see what, as you say, Brendan, what kind of form these abstract arguments about risk had taken and how that had changed over time. And I think there are some things we pulled out, but I'll turn it over to Geoff.
Well, no, yeah, I mean, it was fascinating. I mean, one great takeaway was that we realized that halfway through the trip that the whole thing was tax deductible, which was exciting in the United States scenario. So always choose a good trip for research purposes. But more seriously, it was actually really interesting to look at. What we wanted to try to do was show how the geography and the spaces of quarantine have evolved over time. There are certain things that have stayed the same, the way that we separate people from goods, the way that we use courtyards or outdoor spaces or verandas as spaces of decontamination and exposure. And so there are certain architectural similarities that you'll notice have just mutated and maybe changed dimension, but are fundamentally the same, kind of a syntax. But on the other hand, what's really interesting about quarantine is that When it first really kicked off in the Adriatic Sea, half the reason it did that was because it was this place of encounter between Mediterranean Europe and the Near East. And so there were goods going back and forth and merchants going back and forth, but there were also germs going back and forth. And so it was a place of disease exposure and thus a place where quarantine was needed. But to make a relatively long story short, I'd say what's interesting was that, originally quarantine depended on the use of islands and peninsulas, places that were outside the city. The whole point was that you wanted to prevent something from arriving because you knew that something monstrous or infected or dangerous or diseased was on its way to the city. And so you wanted to prevent it from showing up as right away. And so you'd stick it on a peninsula or stick it on an island or make it anchor out in the bay. So what was interesting, though, is that as quarantine changes over time and is experimented with, Venice as a city of islands was kind of a laboratory of quarantine, because all you'd have to do is experiment with a different island or cut off a certain bridge or move to an even further island out in the lagoon, and you could change the context of quarantine. But eventually, just to make, again, a long story short, one of the arcs of the book shows that now quarantine takes place in the very heart of the thing that is meant to be protected. And so instead of relying on natural geographic features like islands and peninsulas or even mountain ranges, instead we now rely on extremely redundant HVAC systems, very good wastewater handling systems and whatnot inside buildings. And so a great example of that is actually, we went to an animal disease research facility that used to be on the very tip of, basically practically outside the United States. It was on a very tip of Long Island near New York. But now it's in the very heart of cattle country. And so, it seems insane, actually, to take something where you're studying foot and mouth disease and you're studying anthrax and you're studying these incredibly virulent pathogens, and you're doing it, in the very heart of where all of those animals live. But that just shows, that's an interesting way, I think, to just show that quarantine has moved from the edges to the very center of things.
And yet there's similarities as well. So that while we were charting the sort of changes we were, and that geographic kind of movement of where quarantine takes place, it was also, fascinating to see the concern with ventilation, which was expressed in, arcades and porticos and courtyards in, the 1400s, crop up in conversations about COVID today, and adequate ventilation became, the key to, getting back to quote unquote normal life. So seeing one of the concerns always was what to do in quarantine. Binge watching Netflix might be new, but wondering what to do with all this downtime is totally not new. So the idea of the loneliness and need for support in quarantine in the 1400s and 1500s, that was expressed in these kind of architectural ways of creating a little pulpit, say in the center of the quarantine hospital, the lazaretto, or on the wall of it, so that they could reach, so that one priest could sort of preach to the masses, and you could have a sense of being together and supported despite being alone. Which is something that, again, we saw during COVID, when church congregations weren't allowed to gather, and instead sort of priests would spray parishioners with a water gun of holy water so that they could be 6 feet apart. But these kinds of innovations, to see that resonance across history was fascinating from a design point of view, because it sort of pointed us to these recurring problems that require solutions for quarantine to work.
Yeah, you also allude to in the book the idea that not all quarantines are created equal, which is something we've seen again play out today, where the quarantine experience of someone like Ellen DeGeneres, I think at some point she complained and got a huge amount of backlash because she was complaining about boredom in her mansion when everybody else was holed up in their tiny homes, or Kim Kardashian having an exclusive island party where everybody was tested. And you point to some historical disparities as well, isn't there, from the past?
Oh, completely. And this is another fascinating thing, where quarantine actually started out a split in some ways. So when it was being applied to merchants, people coming from overseas, there was, they could sort of pay for a better version of quarantine. But when the city itself, say Venice, was under siege from the plague, was in the middle of its own outbreak. Quarantine functioned in a much more communal way, and entire neighborhoods would come and be sort of isolated together, alone together in the lazaretto. And so it was a much more communal experience. But over time, as it progressed and as more people traveled, honestly, I mean, you have to think when quarantine was first formalized in the Adriatic, you would have merchants, or you would have people of your own city falling ill from the plague, but not many other people were traveling. But as soon as you get leisure travelers, you start getting to be able to pay for upgrades. And there's just this amazing painting of some Hungarian aristocrats in their room in the Malta lazaretto, and they've done it out with potted plants. The room's big enough. They wrote letters home. The room is big enough you could play tennis in it, and they did. So it could be very nice, or it could not, and that is something that again has sort of played out even today.
Yeah, one of the most interesting strands in the book for me that helped me a lot in kind of considering what's playing out today is how you talk about quarantine not just being a result of technocratic processes, but being highly influenced by cultural practices and historical practices. And so you mention quite early on in the book, in China, the Fangzang system, in which people collectively go to one place in order to quarantine. And so, it harkens back to communist notions of community organization or labor organization. One does it in a collective. You also mention, I think it was Australia, more nefariously, and kind of the notion of the yellow peril. And so we kind of look in a very admiring way to Australia at the moment for their ability to have been able to shut things down so quickly. But they have this kind of dark kind of reason. Well, maybe it's exaggerated, but there is some historical practice there based on xenophobia and or racism, which allowed them to do that. New Zealand, similarly, with its strict policies on preventing plant and foreign animal species from coming in there. So it's not simply that people are just magically better in one place or another, but they're coming up with borrowed solutions from practices that they've been doing for a long time. And one of the funniest contradictions that you point out, I think, is the one about America, where the imposition of your civil liberties is anathema, but at the same time, that notion of civil liberties, which produces the quote unquote rugged individualist, makes Americans perfectly adept at quarantine. Totally fine and happy to be on their own. Versus, I don't know, with it. You mentioned another person in the book who from somewhere else. I think it was. I'm going to screw it up if I say it, Guyana or Africa.
Democratic Republic of Congo. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Who said, the notion of individual quarantine without connection to one's family would be totally.
It's funny though, because I think that one of the things that we found here in the United States was that culturally and psychologically, especially here in Los Angeles, which is kind of it's almost like a smaller version of the United States compressed into a little zip drive, it's just, but in the shape of a city. There's so many of the things that Los Angeles residents and Americans are good at is being alone, sitting in their cars, streaming Netflix, living alone in large houses in the middle of subdivisions, with no children around. There are things that sound like quarantine, and so therefore we being Americans would be quite well prepared for it. But at least two things are interesting there, which is that the minute you ask someone or you require them to quarantine, you get into such an amazing political backlash in terms of, you may be home watching Netflix all the time, and that may be your dream for the weekend. You're just going to go home from work and just stream Stranger Things all weekend. But the minute you have to do that because Joe Biden says that you have to do it, it's like the basis of a political revolution. But then what's also interesting is that, and I think there's something very telling about this, just as a general human observation, the things that we enjoy doing, reading books, watching films, hanging out in our own homes, kind of in a respite from the world. The minute you have to do it, it becomes psychologically intolerable. The idea that this is what we're stuck doing forever. You want to do anything but watch Netflix. There was a series of ads actually in Germany, which was just kind of funny, that showed, what are the things that we can do to help save, contemporary culture. And it was just basically just sit on the couch and watch TV. Like, that's all we're asking. Just do that, and you will be the heroes of this generation. But in any case, so I just think it's quite interesting that it's actually sometimes hard to predict what culture will necessarily respond to quarantine, because the minute it's mandatory, it's a whole different tripwire, and different sorts of cultural and political arguments come up because of that.
And I would say also, to your sort of your point about a design brief, these different possible responses are really fascinating design challenges in and of themselves. And to move from quarantine to isolation, one of the interesting sort of snippets in the book is we went and visited the high-level isolation unit at the Royal Free in London, and they get a lot of stick there, actually, for the weird system that they have. Everywhere else in the developed world isolates highly infectious patients using negative pressure in the room itself, so that all the air gets sucked inwards, and by having everyone who goes into the room who isn't the patient wear this very, you've all seen it, the PPE with the Tyvek suits and the boots and the masks and the goggles and everything. The UK, for its high-level isolation unit, doesn't do that. It uses it has a special name, but it's basically a plastic bubble, and but it has sort of suits built into the side of it, so you can just kind of insert yourself into the wall and treat the patient, and the patient is in the bubble. And what's fascinating about that is that the doctors themselves don't have to wear PPE, so their faces are visible to the patient. Also, that means that non-medical personnel, like family members, can insert themselves in the wall. You need special training to put on PPE and wear it safely and take it off without contaminating yourself. But anyone can insert themselves in the wall of these bubbles. And so if you need a specialist from a different department, you need a family member to visit, they can sort of pop themselves in the wall. I climbed in immediately before they told me that the decontamination procedure was still experimental from having the last person in there. But you would think it would be very claustrophobic, and I'm sure it is after a certain number of days. But there was something very refreshing as well about actually being able to see faces and see the room around you clearly and communicate with everyone. And what's been interesting is that model, which, for a long time was just sort of this one hospital room at the Royal Free, has since been adopted in Ebola-stricken regions of Africa, where, as you mentioned, this idea of sort of being isolated from your friends and family in quarantine or isolation is so horrific and just really unbearable. There's a Congolese doctor who's sort of designed a kind of a low budget version of it, where people with Ebola or potential exposure to Ebola are put in a little plastic bubble. Then when the PPE shortage hit the US at the start of COVID-19, one hospital in Boston started using these, you can make it with parts from Home Depot, the DIY store. And they even built in, which I quite liked, a hug wall, so that whoever was in isolation could actually even, the suit was big enough that you could even get a whole hug. But it was just really interesting to me, because what you end up as your spatial means for creating separation can look so different depending on what you think the priority is. Is the priority being able to hug, being able to see people's faces, or is it this sort of engineered isolation that is at least the norm here in the US?
Yeah, in fact, I think I wanted to mention near the end of the book, you talk about this diversity of options, and you question the idea, do we want monolithic approaches? Especially, as you mentioned, Geoff, in a city as multicultural as LA, you're going to have people who are going to want to quarantine differently and react to situations differently. So that poses a whole bunch of interesting challenges for a state or for governance in the future. I wanted to open up to questions soon, so I had a bunch more things I wanted to ask, but let's get towards the end of the book where you talk about, I think for this crowd, what would be interesting is this discussion about the smart home and bringing notions of the smart home in a direction I had never really thought of before, which is the idea of anticipatory or predictive quarantine, so that your home will know before you do whether or not you need to shut in or not. Do you want to talk about it a little bit in general?
Sure, I can take that one. It was that was research that was both exciting and very ominous. What we were looking at was the rise of diagnostic tools in the shape of interactive appliances. And an example of that would be that Amazon recently patented a way for its Alexa interactive speaker to actually recognize signs of respiratory disorder. So if you're coughing or sniffling, you might be sick, but also even signs of depression. In a way that just sounds almost like a bad joke, it'll actually respond to a depressed owner by suggesting that you stream a new movie, or perhaps you look back through your shopping list and you buy something again that you've previously purchased. So obviously there are very, aside from just the absurdity of that, there are very obviously ethical questions about what happens when private companies are engaging on a medical or even emotional level with their own customers. But what we wanted to look at was the rise of these kinds of tools. And so you see this also in assisted living communities for the elderly, where things like using Doppler radar to see if someone has fallen inside their house. There's actually a great other book out by a journalist named Emily Anthus, who has covered a lot of this in a really exciting way. But also mirrors, so that when you're looking in the mirror, there's a little camera on the other side of the mirror, like the Truman Show, but it's actually watching for your skin tone or even the pulse in your neck. And it can tell if you're having a stroke or if you're maybe suffering from cardiac difficulties. So my point is that the home is becoming a kind of three-dimensional medical diagnostic tool that we just live within. And when you then hook that up to the companies that are running these objects, bear in mind that at least in the United States, Google owns Nest, which is a company that does thermostats. They also have the front door system, so that your front door is networked to your phone, to cameras, etc. And they know your Google search history, obviously. So if you're looking things up like flu symptoms or where do I get medication to treat this illness, and you're cranking the thermostat, which implies that you're cold or feverish. And for your mirror is deducing that you have cardiac issues that are a sign of COVID. Or another great little detail was that at one point Amazon, people realized that Amazon scented candle reviews were all becoming very negative, and that was a sign of COVID-19 infection because everyone was losing their sense of smell, and it was being correlated with negative candle reviews. In any case, to make a long story short, you put all that together. And you have this very ominous possibility that companies will decide that it's in the public interest to just simply not let you out that day. That your house will preemptively decide that quarantine is a public necessity, and it is something that the house itself is going to enforce. We go into much more detail about it in the book, but that's the general notion. And so the brief takeaway from that is that we're entering a world, we think, where there'll just be a quarantine mode. And that we can go into that. Our homes will simply switch over. Infrastructure in the city itself will simply go back to quarantine mode. We see it right now with one-way aisles in supermarkets or junctions and intersections changing in terms of the lights and the pedestrianization of streets.
Or QR codes to enter certain things.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Or at some point you mentioned different hours for people quarantining to be able to go out even.
Exactly.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we see it even at least in the United States where there were elderly hours. So it was kind of comical, but like from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m., anyone over the age of 70 could go shopping at local supermarkets. But that kind of differentiation and restricted access based on health status, I think is the future, or is part of the future of quarantine, and it's certainly something we'll see through smart homes, but also smart urban infrastructure.
And I think for us, the interesting sort of thing to tease out of all of this is ubiquitous sensing is here. It could be useful. I mean, for the idea of these kind of sentinel sort of things that can give us early warning is something that has been done in very non-technological ways by public health authorities for years. I mean, the city of LA has its own flock of sentinel chickens that it keeps outside the city to see whether they've been bitten by mosquitoes with West Nile virus. So there've been these low tech means. Now it's gone very high tech. And to us, the question is not sort of, are these good or bad, but who owns this data and what are they incentivized to do with it? Because of course, Amazon is not, as a publicly traded company, its incentive is to make profits for its shareholders, not, now I'm saying that, I'm like, is it publicly traded? Anyway, its incentive is to make money, as we know, and
go to space.
Go to space. Yeah.
And public health is not necessarily its major goal. So it's not that this data is bad or that being surrounded by sensing devices is inherently a disaster. It's a question of where does that information go and who is doing what with it.
All right. So, Claire piped in at the perfect moment when I was about to open this up to questions and has put out, the classic question about writing a book, which was, what was the most surprising sort of quarantine that you encountered?
Oh, such a good question.
That was a good question.
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite ones that we did, just because it was so surreal, was the visit to the International Cocoa Quarantine Center in Reading. And I think, this audience will know Reading is not exactly a glamorous tropical location. And yet every cacao plant that moves around the globe, which has to happen because there are 3 major chocolate growing regions in the world and they're all quite far apart. So you have to move plants around, but they all go for a 2 to 3 year holiday in Reading en route. And that's there for this very sensible reason when you think about it, which is there's nothing in the UK that can be threatened by cacao diseases because it's a very untropical country, and there's nothing in the UK other than the weather that can threaten these plants. Actually, if the power goes out to this greenhouse, the plants have about a minute before they die because it gets too cold too quickly. So that's the major anxiety there. But it was just kind of fascinating to visit this very surreal little pocket of tropical rainforest with the world's traveling cacao plants all being kept safe, until they were proven safe in Reading, of all places.
Natalie Kane has a question. Natalie, I feel like I should plug her, the curator of digital at the V&A.
Hello.
Hi, Natalie. Sorry, was that too much? You had to I had to unmute you.
Hi, I'm kind of in my own sort of weird quarantine at the moment because I'm not allowed to leave the house for like a month because of my back surgery, which is very weird. So it's a kind of a weird quarantine. Wow. It's not COVID this time, which is very weird. I asked my question in the box, but because I wasn't sure if we were asking questions. But I always think about from my own kind of personal and professional interest is like what we kind of assume in some ways that this is, as you said, is not going to be the last time that we do it, and especially from the UK, I think there's always this kind of both this sort of, I don't know, people are always tired about the fact like, oh, we're going to always be going into quarantine. It's going to be the kind of the case forever. And I'm interested in both states of being will go on to kind of affect both the infrastructural and architectural things that you mentioned. I mean, the smart home thing is very much my interest, and I'm really glad that you raised it. Both the kind of infrastructural and architectural effects, but also the sociological and emotional effects of repeated quarantines now that we see that on the horizon, because obviously you've seen it from a very historical lens, and often there's this assumption that quarantines end and they stop, and like eventually they'll be kind of will fold into other greater kind of systems of being. But these larger kind of ones, particularly things like pandemics, or now we see things like antibacterial resistance is happening potentially on larger scales. What do you see the greater effects being of this as it comes to a larger global scale in particular?
Unless you were about to answer.
Well, I was just going to mention my favorite thing in the book, which is something called the jerk study. But we were curious about how it just seemed we went to pandemic simulation after pandemic simulation. We spoke to public health official after public health official, and yet no one had really planned for like the lived experience of quarantine. So what does it do to people? How are they going to feel? And so we in one of the chapters we speak to a boredom researcher, and she told us about this research she's done that she calls the jerk study, which is where you expose people to extremely boring things, like a 20-minute video of a rock, and then you ask them if they'd like to do something mean or bad. So, take money away from another person. You give them that option just for no reason other than to have something to do, or shred some fictional shredding of worms, just to do anything other than watch this stupid rock. And people do it. And her takeaway was, look, if people only have bad options and they're bored, they will do those bad options. What we need to do for quarantine is it doesn't need to be fun, but it does need to be meaningful. People need to not be bored. And boredom is a signal that you have no sense of purpose at that. You're not engaged with what you're doing. So is there a way? Quarantine has a purpose. You're helping, you are making a unique contribution to the public good, but it doesn't feel purposeful. And is there a way to make it feel that way? And I think that's one of the, going back to Brendan's design briefs, I think that's one of the most interesting design challenges that the quarantine poses, especially as you say, as we will keep going in and out of it, is how do we make it feel meaningful? It is meaningful, but it doesn't feel meaningful.
And I think just briefly, I might add to that. I feel like the long-term infrastructural effects, I think, will be really interesting to watch. And I think they're quite hard to predict. I mean, I think that much of this will stick around, and I think a lot of it is going to be unpleasant. I think that what is being realized is that differential access to public infrastructure works, and it's going to be applied more more freely in the future. Ironic use of the word freely, but the idea that you can't get on the tube because of certain you don't have the right code for Tuesdays. Things like that sound really sci-fi, but we already do it. We do the congestion charging. If you drive into a certain part of London, you get flashed and charged, and they have similar things in the United States now for congestion, and high speed lanes and that kind of thing. But in any case, that kind of infrastructure will stick around until we forget where it came from. We won't even realize that it's quarantine infrastructure. We'll just think it's part of public transit, or we'll think that it's just simply part of policing people's access to public space. And so that stuff will stick around. But also, just briefly, I'd say the long-term emotional effects is actually more complicated, I'd say, because it sounds really like dystopian at first. What is the effect of isolating people like this and for long periods of time? But I might even be one of these people. But I feel like some people kind of responded to the last year with a sense of almost like relief, like, oh, there are things I don't have to do anymore. I ironed a shirt for the first time like a year this morning. But it just things that I don't have to do, and I don't have to go out and I'm not missing out on things, and I can just putter around in the garden at the risk of sounding like I'm already like 75 years old. Anyway, but my point is simply that so for some people the emotional effect will actually be quite liberating. You don't have to do this stuff anymore, but for other people it'll be like terrorizing. But so I just feel like that'll be the kind of thing that will is entirely subjective, is culturally and emotionally up to individual people.
And like Brendan says, I thought that was really astute. Quarantine, it can't be one size fits all. That makes it hard because public officials want a thing that they can do that works. And actually, quarantine will work much better if it's not one size fits all. And so finding a way to manage that is another of the challenges.
Ethel, I don't know if I do. There we go. Oops. You're still there. You are. Hi.
Thank you so much, Geoff and Nicola. Fascinating. It's on my wish list already, the book. I have been following your work for a long time ago, so I was, by listening to you and knowing about the topic, I was thinking if there are connections. I was thinking especially about food, for example, because the most recently pandemics started in a market, in a food market. And I don't know if along the book, because of course you are launching it today and we have not read it, if there are these kind of, we can find connections with these other parts of your works, or or this kind of relation with, I was thinking, especially with food in your case, how it changed with when you are quarantined, or how it affects the way that we distribute food, because it can be a vehicle, or also for transmit some viruses or whatever. And in the case of Geoff, I was thinking more about the speculative design and, I don't know, the future of this smart home and these technologies. You have already talked about that a lot, but these are the two things that came to my mind when I was listening to you guys. So I don't know if you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, I have to apologize because I didn't really ask any food questions here, but a substantial part of the book is indeed about food. So.
Okay.
No, but I'm sure Nicola can go into more detail about the crossover, because I think you're right. I mean, there's a substantial amount to be learned from that.
I think it's a topic that connects very clearly. So yeah.
Definitely. No, I'm really glad you asked, because obviously that chapter is, they're all my babies, but that's my special baby. And we do have a chapter looking at agricultural quarantine. That's where we visit the International Cocoa Quarantine Center, for example, the one in glamorous Reading. But yeah, it to me was actually, and again, I'm just finding myself in the role of mega downer, but the people who had spent years warning us about human pandemics, and then one happened, while we were researching the book, a lot of people spent a lot of time telling us about agricultural pandemics, and the pull quote is, "We're only one pathogen away from starvation." It's actually a bit more nuanced than that, but I would say that our agricultural system is as, if not more, vulnerable than our human sort of system was when it came to detecting and preventing these kinds of, animals, and crops have viruses that attack them too. So that chapter is terrifying in some ways, fascinating in others. Now, one of the things that I thought was a brilliant design solution is redesigning shipping containers. The current shipping containers, some researchers in Australia studied 1 day's worth of shipping container imports into, I think, the port of Perth, maybe Brisbane. Anyway, and they discovered 3,000 quarantinable pests. So things that could wipe out, fields, herds, harvests. The shipping containers are just kind of riddled with nooks and crannies. And in the book, we talk about a very unlikely sort of group to have come up with a solution to that, which is Chevron, the oil giant. Bizarrely, and it's really unlike me to have good things to say about them, but they did redesign. They had to quarantine. Long story short, they had to quarantine an island off of Australia so that they could extract all its natural gas. And as part of doing that, they had to promise to keep it pristine. And one of the ways that they realized was going to, bring in lots of invasive species were the shipping containers. So they just redesigned them. And it's same price. We could never manufacture another shipping container the old way again, and just gradually roll these new design out and reduce pests and invasive species traveling the globe, exponentially. So that's a long answer, but there's a whole chapter on it. So I'm excited for you to read it. We managed to squeeze in our interest. Geoff even got burglary stories in there. So
that's true. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say, the smart home kind of stuff was definitely a nice gesture toward speculative design, as well as the chapter on nuclear waste, and the design and the communication systems about communicating risk so that people don't dig the nuclear waste back up. But yeah, I guess I'll just use that example that Nikki mentioned. Having written an entire book about burglary, it was really interesting to read about how, especially actually during the Black Death, people who were either had the bubonic plague and recovered and were therefore now naturally immune to the pandemic, became burglars. And then also houses, because at the time, you didn't quarantine in your own house, you would quarantine at the communal lazaretto. And so your house would be marked as infected or as quarantined. But so immune burglars basically formed a kind of criminal network and would break into houses and then steal things from those houses. And then sometimes even break into the lazaretto and steal goods out of the good airing yards. And then potentially risk, pandemics breaking out in the city because of that. But so it was really interesting to see a kind of overlap between A Burglar's Guide to the City and quarantine research, which was pretty exciting for me at least.
Ethel's now mentioning something that we could mention really quickly, because I think you have a good answer to it about low skill infrastructural stories that look at low skilled workers, which help the system keep going while the rest of us privileged ones stayed home. Now, you do have something about an Amazon patent that might be worth discussing, but maybe you have something more specific.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, there's I might actually maybe skip the Amazon thing, actually, just because I feel like a great example, I think, would actually be from, I mean, the story, and Nikki can address this maybe better than I can, but the story of essential workers, the people that actually have to do the frontline work of cleaning, of maintaining urban infrastructure, of actually dealing with bodies, is a great example of how exposure is a sort of a site of privilege, I guess you could say, where those who can avoid exposure.
In Dubrovnik, which is the city that sort of issued the very first quarantine regulations in the world, in those same regulations said that only people who had nothing essential to do could leave the city. So the concept of essential workers being forced to assume those risks while others, non-essential people, can leave and reduce their exposure goes back to the origins of quarantine and has been the first people prosecuted for breaking these health regulations were also some of the essential workers, grave diggers who were accused of robbing bodies that they were burying. So none of the elites of Dubrovnik ever suffered any consequences or were, called to justice for any breaches of quarantine. It was always the essential workers. And in some ways, it gave the city an even greater control over this population that they then also mistrusted very deeply. So you can see those tensions play out that you still see today, play out in the very first sort of formal quarantine in Dubrovnik in the 1370s. So definitely an unsolved problem. And I think, if people knew and saw these historical examples, we might have be more thoughtful about trying to avoid making the same mistake again. That's our hope, anyway.
Let's see if anybody else has a question. Otherwise, I'd like to finish with a very selfish, somewhat insider baseball question, but I'd love to know just a little bit about the process of co-writing a book together and how you manage that work. Is this the first thing you've written together, first of all?
First book we written together. Yeah, we've done some small stuff.
Articles and things, yeah. We're married for those
we'd written Christmas cards and stuff together.
Cards, yeah.
No, I mean, it was a challenge until it wasn't, I guess is what I would say. It was kind of hard to figure out exactly how to break up the work and make the book function. But I think that two things happened. One was we just realized that, we could kind of divide and conquer in a really successful way. So chapters that we were just naturally enthusiastic about or that sort of overlapped with our work a little bit more. So like agricultural or food quarantine just seemed like a no-brainer for Nikki to take. We were able to, one of us would take a stab at a certain chapter and then we'd hand it off to the other to then go back through and edit it and kind of rewrite it in their way and then hand it back to the next. And we just did that for every chapter. So it's kind of like weaving back and forth because the goal was that you wouldn't be able to read the book and say, okay, I can tell Nikki really wrote chapter 3 or Geoff wrote chapter 7 or whatever it might be. And I think that the other thing that happened that was just helpful was honestly, we were able to wrap things up by the only option available to us for recreation was hiking, because during lockdown when we had to get the book finished and off. So we happened to, we live in Los Angeles and we happen to live near a mountain range called the Verdugo Mountains. And we just found this great hike. And we did it at one point, we were doing it almost nearly every single day, but we would just do this massive loop up into the mountains and back again. And that's where we basically just talked about the book the entire time. So it was actually a really useful collaborative thing where we broke down chapters. We talked about whether or not there was somebody we needed to follow up with for a last minute interview. We went through, what images we might want to use in the book, whether or not we wanted maps. Those conversations were really great when we could just get out and get sunlight and fresh air and had access to a park. So that was something that was just a great reminder of just how important those kinds of urban amenities are, certainly for the creative class, I guess.
It's really, we write so completely differently. It was a fascinating, one might say, ill-advised endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
I love a structure. I really like an outline, and my room was covered in Post-it notes that I was organizing into different columns to know where everything went and so on. And Geoff is a man who likes to see where the words take him. And you can imagine that's not a recipe for a happy sort of collaboration, putting words directly on the page together, which is why I think we sort of split the chapters, did our own thing, and then worked together, to edit them, to put, add fresh stories in our own ways, etc., and just kind of build it out. But yeah, it was interesting. Unfortunately, we don't mind editing each other. There wasn't a mortal offense caused by the fact that Geoff thinks I use according to
way too often.
And he's not wrong. I hesitate to say he's right, but he's not wrong. So yeah, fortunately that piece was at least relatively smooth. But yeah, it was interesting.
Well, you not only survived with your marriage intact, but you did what everybody else said they would do, but didn't, which was they said, this is the perfect time to write a book, and you managed. So I'm filled with not a small sense of envy that you've managed to do it. Geoff, Nick, this was so good, so interesting. Thanks for opening up the opportunity. I hope the rest of your book launch schedule goes really well. Manager, I don't know if you had any closing words that you wanted to share?
Just to thank all of you for this incredible conversation, and also as a reminder to please buy the book, which is really incredible. And I think today has made everyone in the audience probably want to do that if they didn't already. So Andrew's posted the link in the chat, and you can also find it on our website with the event listing. But thank you all so much.
Thank you all. And thanks, Brendan and Manager. This was terrific. Really fun way to launch our book. So, and great questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending.
All right. See you when we see you.
Great. Stay safe.
Hang in there. Bye.